And so this next section that we're doing is on detention centers today.
Okay, there we go. All right, so here, you guys. Okay, sure. So we'll just do this. Okay, so we have a panel who are our experts today on child detention today. So each of the panelists will be answering a question. So the first panelist is Sarahi. She is from Wisconsin. So Sarahi, what are the current policies on immigration and detention today, in reference to immigrant children?
All right, hello everyone. So I'm fortunate that I have two immigration lawyers in my family, so I called them up to make sure that I had very good information. One of the things they wanted me to share, though, that lawyers, a lot of immigration lawyers right now are feeling very frustrated with changes that are happening so quickly, and so even for them, it's a challenge to keep up with little things that are regularly changing. But when we think of immigration policies and how they are affecting children, one of the biggest change that we are seeing is the fact that when a child is coming here, and even like with their family or not, is going into the entry points. So the change is that they're saying they have to go into one of the entry points in order to be considered for asylum. And that's different than in the past. As long as they came in, it didn't matter exactly where, they could still apply for asylum. And so that's very tricky, because when for some families, they're just thinking, all right, we need to get there and we can apply for asylum. But now to add that spin to it of saying, nope, you have to go in through entry points in order to be able to seek that asylum. So that's something that really has been affecting the families and the children. And another thing is that there's such a backlog for countries from the Northern Triangle. And when we say the Northern Triangle, those are countries from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So according to like my family member who's a lawyer said, there are children who can be waiting for years in order for their cases to be heard. Another important thing to note is that we hear more about asylum, but there's also something that really affects children, and that is SIJ. And for the SIJ, that is where children can get a pathway to even permanent residency if they are in fear because of some type of abuse. And right now, something that isn't as in the media as much is the fact that there are attempts to change laws within that. So the current policy is that children, as long as they're with one parent who can file for the SIG and get that protection for the child, they could get it. But right now there are attempts to make it so that two parents would have to file. So that's tricky, because in some cases, if for whatever reason there is just that one parent, then we're saying that they can't get the protection that they need, even they have been experiencing the abuse. So that's something that is very important to keep on reading up on, because it isn't in the media as much. We're not hearing as much about it, but there are attempts to change that. So definitely a lot going on with children and policies and how it's affecting them.
All right, the next question is for Amy T. Andersen from New Jersey. Can you give us an overview of child detention? How many children, what states, how many facilities, etc.?
Well, one issue with coming up with those numbers is they really aren't readily available, because the Department of Health and Human Services isn't necessarily keeping track. But we know that there are about 100 shelters in 17 different states, and those states are along the coast and the border. Estimates of around 15,000 children at this point. Last September, it was reported to Congress that there were 12,800 children in federally contracted shelters, and then in December, the update was 15,000. Another issue with the Department of the Department of Health and Human Services is they don't really have an accurate database for tracking children. So in April, they lost track of 1,475 children, and then in September, another 1,500 children. They couldn't account for their whereabouts. So that's extremely concerning. Another statistic that I found is that of the 100 shelters across the country, they're at 92% full capacity. Okay, I think that's about, is that a good overview? Yeah, I think that's...
I'd just like to add that sometimes in our communities we don't realize that there's a detention facility because it's a juvenile detention facility, and we need to recognize that some of these children are being held in juvenile detention. So, number 3 is Manuel. He is from Connecticut, and he will be telling us what do we know about how children are being treated in these facilities, and how has this impacted the children who have been detained?
Thank you. We have heard from many media outlets that some of these children have been sleeping on the floor. They're in crowded rooms. Lately, though, we have heard that some of that has improved a little bit. What has not improved, though, is the help we're giving them in terms of their medical needs and their physical needs. As per the Homestead, Florida facility, they were asked to provide one clinician at a ratio of 1 per every 12 children. However, in the last report that was run back in November, they found that they had one clinician for every 20. In there. So they do have now rooms where some of these children go and play games, but once again, they are kept in very small rooms. As per their education, we have learned that, it's specifically to Homestead, Florida, they have a big tent that they have broken down into small rooms in which students receive some education provided by instructors who do not have a teaching certification. However, they're required to have a bachelor degree and to speak English and Spanish. It's known that the superintendent at Homestead had asked the government if she can oversee the educational program at this facility, and she has been told repeatedly not to get involved. We're not sure why the government doesn't want that. To provide these children with the education that they need. As for the impact that all of this has on our children, it goes from anxiety to depression, to separation anxiety as well, and most importantly, the aftermath of trying to reconnect with their parents. As an immigrant myself, I come from Honduras, and I didn't grow up with my family, with my mom. I didn't join her until I was 18, and I can tell you that it was a hard transition trying to make a connection with my parents then. And I was living in Honduras in good conditions, so I can only imagine what these kids are going to have to go through afterwards. And I think that we need to call on the government to not only provide what these children need in all these facilities, but also afterwards, because they're going to be dealing with a lot of mental and physical issues as we move forward.
Thank you so much. All right, next we have Ivonne. from New Mexico, and she will be telling us who is profiting off of child and immigrant detention, and what leverage do teachers have to end these human rights abuses.
Thank you. And I love this question because it's asking what is the issue, but then also what can we do about it, right? And so I think the idea of profiting from child incarceration and immigrant incarceration is really twofold. And the first part of it, in terms of profiting, is any politician that benefits from fear-mongering and saying that immigrants are criminals and saying that we need to keep them out and that we need to make America great again and that there is a national emergency. That's the first level of profiting, right? In order to push their own agenda. On the other hand, there is the profiting that is actually monetary, that has to do with money. The New York Times has reported that imprisoning children is a multi-billion-dollar business. For example, the Southwest Key programs, and they have won at least $955 million in federal contracts since 2015, which is just outrageous. There is an organization called Educators for Migrant Justice. I encourage you to visit their website. Again, that's Educators for Migrant Justice. And they are actually, and I didn't know this before doing this research, but they are reporting that many of our education retirement systems, our retirement accounts, are invested into companies that are for-profit prisons. And so on their website, they list 20 states total, including Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Virginia, New Mexico, etc. And so I encourage you to take a look at this website so that we can demand that our retirement accounts are divested from companies that are encouraging this and from companies that are doing this work. Because I will say this again and again, as teachers, we have a responsibility to speak up for the danger our children are facing right now, because we are ready to teach them. The United States needs a comprehensive revamp to the immigration system, but particularly the branch that serves asylum seekers, and teachers have the leverage of being community pillars. Historically and today, teachers have been trusted authority figures, and that we must take very seriously. Communities look up to us to set the example, and our students are looking at our views, they're looking up to us, and we must teach tolerance, equity, and basic human empathy. It is up to us to use our voices in a productive way that demands action. Demands action to end injustice, which is the whole reason that we are here. And I so thank you guys for your presence because it really, really matters. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to encourage you, if you know that your community is considering building a detention center, you can use your voices as educators to speak out against that. I know that we have an educator right here, right now, who did just that. She's back there, and she's doing amazing things. Lindsay Jensen, thank you so much. Okay, Michael Soskil from Pennsylvania. He will be answering, why is educator voice essential in ending child detention? What daily actions can educators take to call for an end to child detention?
So how many teachers do we have here in the audience? I think I speak for all of us when I say that when a child walks in our classroom at the beginning of a school year, we don't ask where they're from, we don't ask where they were born, we don't ask who their parents were. We love them unconditionally because they're ours. When people come to our country, they're ours. And nobody understands that better than a teacher does because we deal with that every day. And that's why our voice is so important. We have to speak up, we have to write, we have to contact people who are in power. We need to not be afraid to step onto that stage and advocate for kids, because if not us, who? And if not now, when? There are children who are suffering right now, and we understand that because we see children that suffer in our classrooms. And we love them, and we know the pain that they're going through. And just because we haven't met these children doesn't mean that we don't understand what they're going through, because we see children suffering on a daily basis. So I encourage everyone, all of you who are watching on the live stream, all of you who are going to watch this at a later date and see the video, all of you who are here, it doesn't end today. You need to continually use your voice. We need to continually use our voice until every one of these children is free, every one of these children has a chance to have a quality education, and every one of these children has the opportunity to do what we want for every one of our students that's in our classroom, and that is to realize their full potential.
And just to add some daily actions that you can do, you can call your legislators, you can go back to your classrooms on Monday if you have school on Monday or Tuesday, and you can teach lessons. You can teach your kids about immigration. You can teach your kids about child detention. You can teach them social justice, to have compassion and empathy, and you can engage your communities to reach out and demand that your legislators close these facilities. I got a little wild, so the last is Stephanie. Do you want Stephanie? Stephanie. She is from my state of Washington. How can educators teach their students in their communities about child detention facilities in our nation?
Thank you, Mandy. So in order to begin the conversation about how educators should approach teaching about detention centers in the classroom as well as within the communities, I think we first have to make 4 acknowledgments. The first acknowledgement is that immigrant and child detention centers do not exist as an isolated phenomenon. They exist as a small piece of a larger system that seeks to profit off the incarceration of Black and brown people as well as immigrants and refugees. This acknowledgement must be made because it helps us frame the realities of what's happening on the borderlands as well as within our communities across the country within the larger racist prison industrial complex. Second, once we begin to understand that immigrant detention and prisons as a whole exist as a reflection of a distinctly racist system, we can then begin talking about our schools. We can begin talking about our schools and how our schools are also a reflection of a racist history and continue to exist as inherently colonizing entities. If we look at the face of public education today, 82% of teachers in public education in the United States are white. This fact represents the inherently racist history of the United States as well as the prisons, and our teaching force is statistically less likely to have interacted with the carceral state, which shapes the foundation of understanding from which they begin to understand the prison industrial complex. This morning I was in conversation with a radical teacher named Ana from San Jose, who leads the Alliance for Black and Brown Advocacy from San Jose, California. She reminded me that at present, the way our schools function actually promote the idea that incarceration and detention are inevitable parts of our society. In school, we send young people to detention every day. We have school resource officers in our high school who we hope will protect our students, but often end up increasing the likelihood that young Black and brown students are arrested on school grounds, introducing them to the school-to-prison pipeline. We must acknowledge that our schools are not removed from what's happening on the ground. This leads me to my third acknowledgement, which is that we as teachers must acknowledge our complicity in these systems and actively engage in a process of self-reflection and critical awareness before we even begin to teach about detention and the carceral state in our classrooms. The last acknowledgement is that when we engage in these conversations in our classroom, Ivonne said it earlier, thank you so much for saying this, is that we have to have the intention of actively divesting from prisons and detention here and globally. This conversation must include conversations about Israel and Palestine and the human rights abuses that exist in Palestine today. We must also talk about the Uyghur Muslims in China. We must also talk about every way in which our government and our schools currently invest in detention and incarceration globally. Thank you.
Okay, is there anything anyone would like to add after hearing the responses from the other panelists? Thank you so much. We hope that you will take this information back and act. Do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. So she says ICE is in a prison in a town near where she lives. And she knows there's a juvenile detention center.
And I want to know how to find out if we have asylum.
And she wants to know how she can find out if some of those children or most of those children are asylum seekers. How does she get involved? Thank you for that question. I think that's a great question. I think there's one assumption that we can make is most likely the kids are asylum seekers. But is there any advice that we can give her about how she gets involved to and engage with the detention center right there in near her community?
I would recommend starting with a phone call. You know, even just calling and just saying you are a concerned citizen and just wanting more information and seeing, you know, from there where to go. And again, like Mandy said, even contacting legislators, senators, and bringing this issue up.
Yeah, so as a teacher, I know when to say that I don't know, and I don't know the answer to that question, but I will tell you this. If that prison is getting federal money, then you have a right under the Freedom of Information Act to find out how that money is being spent and what's going on there. And you have allies that are in powerful positions, legislators that would be willing to help with that. So keep fighting till you know, and don't take no for an answer.
I just want to add to that answer and just really encourage every teacher to reach out to the community organizations that exist. They almost always exist near detention centers, people who are working and advocating on a daily basis to release immigrants from detention as well as support families. I know in my community there are multiple community organizations that are doing this work, and we must take their lead.
I think that's a really, really important point, that there's people in your community who are working on this. Find them. Anything else? Okay, we will continue with the rest of our program. Thank you.